From FingerLakes1.com, you're listening to Inside the FLX. I'm Josh Durso, and our show today starts in Western New York. Rochester-born Tracy Mitrano is an educator, former lawyer, and cybersecurity expert. She says it's time to bring opportunity back to New York's 23rd District. Hard work, education, and community are the tenets of her campaign to take on Congressman Tom Reed this fall, which launched in September 2017. Tracy, thank you so much for being here. It was a struggle to get the schedules worked out, but we did, and I'm glad you're finally here because there's so much to talk about.
I'm grateful for your patience. Thank you.
So, first off, I guess the first question I want to ask is bringing opportunity back to the 23rd. Walk us through that mentality, because I know it's a mentality as much as it is, a campaign promise.
Yes. Well, looking at it from a political landscape, going back to the election of 2008, President Obama, as candidate, promised hope and was realistic, I think, in the moment, but then once in office, confronted with the economic collapse, had so much to do just to stabilize the country that he was unable to deliver on what he had hoped to do. And I think that the disappointment that so many people felt, and this is registered in the election in 2016, as well as 2012, was that now President Trump took advantage of that resentment. But I think people are tired of the rhetoric and they're tired of the bitterness. They simply want opportunity. Not pie in the sky, but not just resentment. And they want to roll up their sleeves, which people in the southern tier and western New York are good at doing. And this is the kind of thinking that I grew up with. If there was something to be done, you rolled your sleeves up and you got to it. And when I got into the campaign, I guess I brought that kind of thinking with me. And when I talk to people on the campaign, that's what I hear them saying they want to do. Right now, we have not had the leadership in the last 8 years in Congress to provide the foundation in order to be able to do it. And that is what I am campaigning to offer voters, is to provide that foundation so they can roll up their sleeves and get at it again.
Stability. So three biggest, I'll let you cherry pick, two or three big issues that you think are really important to get addressed sooner rather than later, so people can start to enjoy some of the better things life has to offer here in the region.
Right. Well, if you talk to an economist about how you create or generate economic development, which translates into jobs, is healthy people. So we need reform of medical care. We need educated people, skilled people. We need a lot of reforms in this area, not only in the K through 12, but in our training, vocational certificate programs, and then also in our higher education. I could happily go into details on all of that. I think the third thing that we need in this district to get the engines going would be infrastructure development. And in addition to roads and transportation, I'm speaking specifically about building out broadband connectivity that would educate young people. It would help farmers who need that kind of connectivity just as much as anybody else does in business these days. And it would provide the foundation that would attract capital back to this region. You simply can't have a business nowadays if you're not properly and robustly connected to the internet.
Is that sort of like the eye-opening factor right now, is that we're talking 2018, broadband access is still fairly limited in rural parts of New York.
Yes.
Is that just, as your background in cybersecurity, your background is in tech, it must be like, come on, how can that possibly be, right?
Yes. Let me clarify just a tad. I was originally an American historian, 20th century American historian. And after law school, I taught family and social policy. So issues such as education, family health care leave, labor policy, medical leave, all of those issues were topics that I covered for years teaching at Cornell University in the human development at the School of Human Ecology. 15 years ago, I shifted into internet policy. I am actually not a technologist per se, but I do internet policy. So to get back to your question, yes, when I thought about running for office and I took a look at this district, that issue did pop out at me. Now, it wasn't entirely a surprise because I'm aware that at the national level, the United States was the country that developed the protocols that the internet runs on. And we were the ones that built out the network. So when it became public in the early 90s, we had the most connectivity of any country in the world, such as it was among and between industry and higher education and government. But it did not take long before other countries began to surpass us, and we are now in the 60s internationally by comparison to all the other countries that have much better both the expanse of it as well as the quality of it. We are somewhere in the 60s now. I think I read recently 63, but it shifts quickly, so I don't want to be held to a specific number. Therefore, this district is not all that different from other places. On the other hand, if you do look at some places that have taken the initiative to build out their broadband, let's look at Chattanooga, Tennessee, they increased their economic development by 40% as a result of that factor.
Makes a difference. Another thing that makes a difference, if you talk to a lot of people, is getting young people to stay in the region. So I want to get your take on just how you think the best way to approach maintaining and growing the numbers of young people, those valuable 20 to 30 somethings in the Finger Lakes, in the excuse me, in the district as a whole.
Absolutely, Josh. Well, I think jobs is really the number one reason why people would be allowed to stay. I mean, you mentioned, thank you, that I grew up in Rochester. My father had a restaurant up there, and I was the only child who could have taken the restaurant over, but instead I did go to college and then after that graduate school. I stayed in this area intentionally because I knew that I wanted to be there for my parents when they needed me as they aged. And I was, and I'm very proud and grateful that I did that. It was a good experience for me to be with them throughout their life. And yet I see that there are families that don't have that opportunity now because the children must leave simply to survive. I am grateful to Ithaca that it provided me a good professional education and a good job. And I have two children, boys who are in exactly the age range about which you're speaking, 21 and 26. And I was able to put them through the public schools in Ithaca, and I'm glad for all of that. But as I look around the rest of the district, that opportunity is not there. And I have one boy who has come back after college and is studying again now at Cornell University. And sometimes he talks about leaving afterwards because he doesn't know whether there will be the kind of opportunity that he's looking for. He's studying artificial intelligence, for example. I have another boy who's gone to school out of state in North Carolina, and he's graduating this spring. He's found a position just outside of Boston. Now, who wouldn't want to go to Boston when you're 21 years old? But it is notable that the kind of opportunities for him as someone who did business and is beginning in tech sales really doesn't have an opportunity to come back here. So I think there are many, many families throughout this entire district that very much want to maintain their family structure, their traditions, their culture, community, neighborhoods, but they have been broken up by the sheer fact that their children have to move out in order to get jobs. And then sometimes as those parents age, they move out with those children. Sometimes they're left behind, and it's not the quality experience that my family had because I was at least close enough to be with my parents on a regular basis.
Now, that issue in and of itself seems to sort of connect to what we'll talk about next is how do you represent the more rural parts of the district while also representing the more urbanized areas? I'm talking about the Ithacas, the Genevas, the Cornings, those types of places, as opposed to the Seneca Fallses and some of the really rural out there locations.
Oh, for sure. Steuben, Allegheny, Cattaraugus, and even in Tompkins and Chemung and Tioga. I think there are two things I want to say about that. One, in terms of representing, you do what you do with everybody. You listen. You ask people, what do you need? What do you want? What's making things unduly difficult for you? I always like the question, if you had a magic wand that you could use in a reasonable way, what would you change? And I have been teaching for 35 years, and so the conversation among and between people on these topics has been part of my life in one context, but it translates into another context of just talking with people and understanding their situation, asking questions, trying to learn more, and mostly listening. The other part of the answer to your question from a political perspective, my observation is the issues that rural 23rd District has are very similar to the issues that the urban 23rd District has. If you ask most farmers what's the number one thing that they would change, most people would think, oh, well, it'll have to do with something specific to agriculture. It's not. It's healthcare. Because one injury, one illness with our current healthcare situation cripples a family. And many farmers are already working with a very thin margin of their marketability. They're all close to bankruptcy for any number of other reasons. And so not being able to trust in having medical care, affordable medical care, is often what will put a family behind the eight ball financially. So that issue is the same throughout this entire district. Likewise, education, and likewise the need for the infrastructure. So what I have come to discover is that maybe people will say things in different ways, or the context will be different, but when you boil it all down, rural and urban, east and west, they all really want essentially the same things.
Now, what do you say to the small business owners out there who are struggling? They're barely getting by. They're waiting to cross that threshold where things get a little easier. Maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. What do you say to those folks who are really just trying to do the best they can, but feel like the state and the federal government just aren't helping them?
Right.
Or even supporting them, for that matter.
Exactly. First of all, and I don't mean to be harping on it, except that it is the big issue that it is. The first thing they would say is, if we as employers did not have to shoulder health care, we could pay our employees more, we could hire more people, we could expand our businesses, we could feel more secure as being a small business owner, we could plan for the future in a way that many small business owners cannot, because historically the United States policy on medical care is to place that burden on employers, large and small. So that's the number one issue. In terms of some of the other issues, I actually opposed almost everything about the tax bill that was passed late last year, except for one aspect. I, too, would have advocated to bring the corporate tax down. I would have coupled bringing the corporate tax down with requiring the corporation to be subject to U.S. tax law. That was a mistake that they didn't put that in there. But for those small businesses that are incorporated in that way and can enjoy corporate law and corporate tax law, I think bringing that tax down was the right thing to do to rejuvenate small businesses as well as large. I think in terms of New York state taxes, which of course is not in the purview of Congress per se, but it's reasonable to talk about it because it's on everyone's mind. I think it would be a good idea for Republicans and Democrats alike to get together in central and western New York and talk about how and in what ways they believe that they are supporting downstate. And if an objective study demonstrates that our high taxes are in fact disproportionately used to support downstate rather than our own area, I would hope that we could cross over the political divide and work together to do something about that, because it is patently, if it's true, then it is patently unfair, and it is something that we should be able to manage in terms of policy, if only because we would have a large circumference of representatives to our state legislature to bring that forward. So those are three areas. There are a lot of other things that a small business person would want, but I'll take the risk then of repeating myself.
Right.
They also need the build out of the infrastructure. I can't think of a business right now that does not use the internet, and it needs it robustly, not a DSL line, not something where you're only getting a few megabits. Almost every single business needs at least 100 megabits, and that is simply not available apart from specific locations, specific universities, and dedicated lines. It simply isn't available at that level.
Now let's switch gears. You've talked a lot about healthcare, and I'm curious about your take, your position on some of the ideas that have been tossed around to combat the substance use disorder dilemma that the region faces. Opioid epidemic, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's something that everyone, rural, urban, across the board, has to deal with. Your thoughts on it and some of the ideas, safe injection sites, that's been kind of a polarizing topic. Obviously, a lot of people would like to see more beds for treatment facilities.
Yes.
Your thoughts on it and what you think some of the things are that could really help spur this problem getting gone in the other direction.
I think the pharmaceutical companies are largely responsible for this crisis, and I think they have to be made responsible for it. How does one go about that? There are now a number of regional, state, and I would hope, but do not expect under this administration, but would hope that federal too would join in lawsuits, not unlike with tobacco, to get the money from these corporations that have not only made so much money, but have caused so much heartache. There's not even the word for it. Of what they have done in this country. I mean, do we need to review the numbers? You know, depending on the study you look at, between 40 and 60,000 people in this country died last year. Since opioids came out in the mid-90s, 200,000 people have died as a result of overdoses. I mean, these numbers are absolutely staggering.
And there's a real issue with underreporting among those numbers as well, which is the sort of X factor that people don't often think about.
That's a good point. So I would begin with tort legal action going against these companies. Both individuals and class action should be able to do that, as well as the government, because of what they have had to absorb to try to address it, everything from emergency medical services to Medicare and Medicaid, mostly Medicaid probably in this case, but not entirely, has had to pay to help people, to pick people up, take them to the hospital, and to rehabilitate them. The second thing that I think could and should be done at the federal level and in Congress is to have hearings on this subject, because it is a crisis of enormous proportion. And if we do not understand how we got into this place, how at the legal level these corporations took a substance that has been known for centuries to be highly addictive and somehow persuade the Federal Drug Administration, somehow persuade the best doctors, best educated doctors in the world that these were somehow going to be safe in across-the-board use, and then unleashed them into society in the way that they did for 20, going on 30 years of spitting them out. I myself have a chronic pain situation in my right trigeminal nerve. And I can tell you, after the surgery that prompted it to be painful, I was prescribed by different doctors mountains of these pills. Now, I was in such pain after the surgery that I filled the prescription because I was afraid to be in that kind of pain. It was totally paralyzing. Eventually, through a variety of methods, I have managed the pain. And I took a Wegmans shopping bag filled with these pills to the police because I didn't want them sitting around the house, especially as my boys were growing older and they were having friends over. And I became aware of what a crisis this was. But how was it that these doctors weren't even talking to each other to say, well, did you prescribe Tracy Mitrano any of these pills? Because if you did, then I won't. I can very much see how it has become the crisis that it has become. And then, of course, there are the awful circumstances where people have become addicted. Then suddenly a doctor or physician will wake up and say, oh, wait a minute, we can't keep prescribing you all of those pills. They shut them off, they're addicted, and then they're going out and looking for opiates on the organized crime black market, which is something we need to also address. I've never understood in this country why it is we cannot get better control over the illegal drug trade. So getting back to my point, I think we need hearings in Congress about why this issue has become the enormous crisis that it is, and look at it from the perspective of both the legal corporations as well as the illegal drug trade, so that we can understand clearly, compassionately, the circumstance of these hundreds of thousands of people who have died, and hundreds of thousands who are addicted, and hundreds of thousands who are still struggling with this issue. So when it comes down to a question of safe sites for injection, if that is the least we can do for somebody, I think that it's probably an appropriate thing to do.
Now, I have to sort of follow up that one with, as far as the cost goes, because that seems to be something that a lot of people get nervous about, especially taxpayers who are already shouldering a lot of the burden on the healthcare front. Your concern as far as that goes, with some folks out there who might be saying, well, this is just going to cost us more. Why should we be paying for more treatment options or facilities or whatever the case may be? What do you say to those folks?
Well, first of all, I say let's go after those corporations and get a lion's share of that money back to where it needs to be, which is to rehabilitate and care for the people who they have harmed by putting out a substance that they knew was harmful. I mean, this really is deja vu all over again in terms of tobacco. So that would be my first approach. Second, it saddens me greatly to see how we scapegoat onto each other the frustrations that we have that belong in a larger context. So instead of focusing on the person who's now addicted and maybe started with legal opiates, now is doing illegal heroin, now there's safe sites, and of course there's the concern not only of their health but the public health of HIV and so forth. We need to be looking at what are the circumstances that bring people to this place. And you and I now have just been talking about the availability of drugs, legal and illegal. But let's also talk about the despair that people feel because there aren't jobs, the marginalization that people feel because there isn't the foundational support in terms of health care, families, housing, education, and jobs, so that they may be more directed and not so susceptible to drugs and addiction. I do believe that in my case, that I mentioned the surgery I had that injured this nerve, if I didn't have children to be looking after, if I didn't have a life that I wanted to live, if I didn't feel a citizenship responsibility to do the best that I can in society and be alert and aware and productive, I could very easily imagine how someone who is in a great deal of pain would just kind of let themselves fall back into that habit. It takes a great deal of discipline, in fact, to do anything but go ahead and capitulate to that kind of addiction when it's being given to you by a doctor. So it's a lot of factors that we have to look at, and it's not just remedied by scapegoating onto the person who is suffering the most vulnerable, and the least able to defend themselves, as I think we do when we take this enormous public health issue and we talk about it focused on the man or the woman who just needs to get high that day. It's a terrible misdirection of what we all need to be thinking and understanding about this issue in order, as a society and as a democracy, to be making the right decisions for all of us.
Now, I want to shift gears a little bit as we close in on our half-hour mark here on the program. The political polarization and how you specifically believe you can win over those folks who are either in the middle or lean a little bit right, because it seems no matter what Democrat you talk to, the realization that winning some Republicans is going to be necessary if any candidate is going to win in the fall.
Yes.
How do you plan on getting that done?
I'm very glad, by the way, Josh, that you didn't say, how are you going to change the Trump voter? Because there isn't one just Trump voter. And let's be realistic. There's probably 35 to 40% of people that are going to vote for Mr. Reed again because of their party allegiance. And as my father would have said, that's all there is to it. Both my parents were Republican, by the way. I do think there are a couple of specific goals that I have in my campaign in order to talk to that specific population that you named, unaffiliates, independents, and let's call them, for the sake of conversation, moderate Republicans, or as you say, Republicans kind of to center, slight right. Number one, let's respect each other as citizens of this United States, and let's recognize that our democracy is at risk right now. There are foreign actors who are weakening us, not just like to weaken us or want to, but I do believe, as the 18 other agencies at the federal level, that the Russians interfered with our election, and they're continuing to interfere. And we have countries such as North Korea where there's a nuclear threat, and we still have terrorism throughout the world that has an impact on the United States, both foreign and abroad. So there are risks externally, but we have a lot of risks internally. The symptoms of a democracy at risk include polarization of politics, the inability to talk through and work through issues, the paralysis that we see Congress in. We must all be aware that what is at stake is serious. And beginning with that premise, the willingness then to be gentlemen and gentlewomen with each other and work very hard at laying a foundation of respect and learning how to talk outside of inflammatory code words. If you read my website, especially on some wedge issues, I think you will see I take great pains to avoid kind of trope language that has exacerbated this divide. I'll give you the example in terms of abortion. I do not use the language pro-choice. I do not use the language abortion is just between a woman and her doctor. The language I use is abortion should be legal, medically safe, available, and affordable. Now, every other person in the world has a right to disagree with me about that. But I think we have a better conversation about it, talking about just the basic reality of what my position is, instead of my coming out of the box and pushing some of that rhetorical, inflammatory language in someone else's face. I don't think it's productive when people would want to do that to me, and I don't think it's going to be very persuasive if I try to do it to them. And then, in addition to these two things that I've mentioned, we really do have to keep trying. It's hard because all of our feelings are hurt. We're all afraid. We're all very scared, but we do different things with our fear. We must work hard to talk with each other in a way that we intend to find common ground and understanding. And I believe, finally, and this will be my last point on it, that the campaign issues of focus in my running apply to Democrats and Republicans, as I said before, rural and urban. Who doesn't want opportunity? Who doesn't want to have affordable health care? Who doesn't want to have good education for themselves if they have to retool because manufacturing is leaving, but we can bring other forms of manufacturing in but require another skill set? Who doesn't want to attract capital to this district and revive our family farms, as well as our small businesses, as well as moving to the next level of new technologies, say in renewable energies or any manufacturing, but it will require training in, for example, artificial intelligence or machine learning. Even at a high school community college level. Not everyone has to have a PhD, but there will be people needed to support the manufacturing that is done technologically. Who doesn't want that? We all want that. And that is what my campaign is about. So not only in terms of rhetoric, not only in terms of respect, not only in terms of working together on our fears about the risks of democracy at this point, I simply believe the issues that my campaign brings forth are the issues that everybody cares about.
And speaking of that campaign, how can folks get involved? That'll be my last question for you before we get you out of here. I know you have a very busy day scheduled. What are some of the ways that people can either connect with you or just get involved with what you're doing?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for the opportunity to answer it. The website is tracymitranoforcongress.com. We have a Facebook page that is Tracy Mitrano for Congress. And I would be perfectly happy if a listener or watcher of this program emailed me at tracymitranocongress@gmail.com. On our Facebook page, and specifically on our website, you can hit a button up at the right-hand navigation for volunteering, for donation, or for just receiving our newsletter that we send out about once a week.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to come up here. And I'm sure we'll be talking again as the campaign moves forward. Obviously, big primary in June, I believe on June 26th, correct?
Yes, sir.
All righty. Well, best of luck, and thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Josh.
Well, that's going to do it for us today. I'd like to thank Tracy, our listeners, and of course, FingerLakes1.com for making this podcast possible. Inside the FLX airs Sundays at 7 p.m. on Spectrum, channel 1304, and is available on iTunes, Stitcher, and the FingerLakes1.com app. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you next time.